It was the largest aircraft the Nazis ever built, a flying giant so massive it could have carried Hitler himself across the Atlantic. But in the chaos of war, it vanished, and to this day, no one agrees on who destroyed it. When people think of World War II, they often picture tanks rumbling across Europe or fighter planes dogfighting high in the skies. But behind the frontline weapons was an entire network of companies racing to build the next engineering marvel. One of those companies was Blohm Voss, and their story is just as dramatic as the aircraft they created. The company's roots go back much further than the war. Founded in 1877 by Hermann Blohm and Ernst Voss, it originally had nothing to do with planes. In fact, their business was all about ships. From their Hamburg shipyard, they built massive steel vessels that sailed across the world. For decades, that's all they were known for: ships, not airplanes. But as the world crept closer to global conflict, opportunities shifted. Germany was rearming, ignoring the strict limits placed on it after World War I. The Treaty of Versailles had banned the country from building much of a modern military, but the Nazis had no intention of following the rules. For struggling companies like Blohm & Voss, this was both a lifeline and a chance to reinvent themselves. By the 1930s, under the management of Rudolf and Walter Blohm, the company pivoted from shipbuilding to aviation. They began working with Lufthansa, Germany's state airline, and soon with the Luftwaffe itself. It was a bold move, a shipyard transforming into an aircraft manufacturer. But it paid off. Blohm & Voss became known not just for ships, but for their flying boats, massive aircraft capable of long journeys over water. This unexpected transformation laid the groundwork for what would come next. Because the success of their first giant flying boat, the BV-222, would inspire them to push the limits even further. And that's where the story of the BV-238 begins. Blohm & Voss didn't just stumble into building giants of the sky. Their first breakthrough was the BV-222 Viking, a massive flying boat that stunned the aviation world. Originally designed for Lufthansa, it could carry passengers across the Atlantic, New York, in just 20 hours. For the early 1940s, that was nothing short of extraordinary. The Luftwaffe quickly saw military potential in the design. If a civilian airliner could haul people across oceans, why not use it for war? The BV-222 was converted for long-range patrols, supply runs, and even U-boat support missions. And while it wasn't perfect, it proved one thing: enormous flying boats could work. That success lit a fire under Blohm & Voss's chief designer, Dr. Richard Vogt. In 1941, he pitched something even bolder: a flying boat larger, heavier, and more powerful than anything seen before. The BV-238. The German Ministry of Aviation gave the project a green light, but there was a catch. Before the full-scale monster could be built, a smaller test version had to fly first. Engineers in Prague constructed a quarter-scale model, the FGP-227, to test its hull design. The results? Disappointing. The model struggled in testing and failed to prove the concept. But in wartime Germany, failure wasn't enough to stop a project with potential. Construction of the real BV-238 began anyway in early 1942. And when the details of the design were revealed, jaws dropped. This wasn't just another flying boat, it was a giant. With a wingspan of nearly 200 feet, longer than some football fields, and a range of almost 6,000 miles, the BV-238 would be capable of crossing the Atlantic with ease. Fully loaded, it weighed around 100 tons, making it the heaviest aircraft on Earth at the time. It was a machine that seemed to defy the limits of engineering, but its size was only part of the story. Because inside this giant, every inch was carefully designed for war. The BV-238 wasn't just big, it was built like nothing else in the sky. Imagine an aircraft so massive that its wings were wide enough to contain passageways, allowing crew members to crawl inside them during flight to service the engines. That gives you a sense of scale. Its construction followed the Blohm Voss trademark style, a strong all-metal frame with a tubular steel wing spar that doubled as an armored fuel tank. In other words, the wings themselves weren't just for lift. They were part of the plane's armor and fuel storage system. The hull stretched long and slim, split into 2 decks. The upper deck was for the crew, pilots, mechanics, gunners, radio operators, about a dozen men in total. Beneath them was the lower deck, reserved for storage, fuel, ammunition, or whatever cargo the mission required. At the very front was a massive hatch door, with the cockpit looming just above it like the command bridge of a warship. Powering this floating fortress were 6 Daimler-Benz DB603 V12 engines, each capable of producing over 1,700 horsepower. Lined up 3 per wing, they gave the BV-238 its muscle. To keep them cool, radiator systems were tucked neatly under each engine, an engineering challenge that had to be solved for such a huge aircraft. But this wasn't just a transport, it was designed to fight. The BV-238 carried multiple defensive gun turrets, twin 20mm cannons, heavy machine guns mounted on its sides, and more. In theory, it could hold off fighter attacks long enough to deliver its payload. And payloads could vary from bombs to U-boat supplies to even entire companies of troops. And then there were the what-ifs. A proposed land plane version, equipped with retractable landing gear and space for up to 300 soldiers, was sketched out but never built. Another variant was imagined with different engines, but it too never left the drawing board. Still, the very idea that this aircraft could have carried an army across the Atlantic shows just how ambitious the design really was. The BV-238 was more than just a flying boat. It was a statement, proof that Germany's engineers could still shock the world even in the darkest years of the war. But ambition on paper was one thing. The real test was whether this steel giant could actually take to the skies. For a machine as colossal as the BV-238, the question was simple: could it even get off the water? According to post-war testimony from its designer, Dr. Richard Vogt, the answer came in 1943. That year, the prototype lifted from the surface of a German lake and climbed into the sky. Some reports place its first flight in early 1944, but either way, the fact that it flew at all was a triumph of engineering. The tests were surprisingly successful. For such a massive aircraft, the BV-238 handled better than many expected. Its engines pulled the 100-ton beast into the air, and the hull skimmed the waves with surprising grace. By the standards of experimental wartime prototypes, this was no disaster. It worked. That success raised a new question: what exactly should the BV-238 do? Originally, it had been designed as a transport, but in the chaos of war, plans shifted constantly. Some within the Luftwaffe wanted to use it as a supply lifeline, carrying fuel, ammunition, and men across the Atlantic to support U-boats hunting Allied shipping. Others imagined it reborn as a long-range bomber, capable of crossing oceans to strike distant targets. The truth is, the plane's potential was wide open. With a range of nearly 6,000 miles, it could have reached far beyond Europe. That made Allied leaders nervous. In the wrong hands, this wasn't just a transport, it was a possible escape vehicle for Nazi officials, or even a weapon against targets thousands of miles away. But just as the BV-238 was proving itself, Germany's priorities shifted. By 1944, Allied bombing campaigns were hammering German industry, and the Luftwaffe was desperate for fighter planes to defend its skies. Building massive transports suddenly seemed like a luxury the Reich could no longer afford. Production plans for additional BV-238s were cancelled. Only one prototype would ever fly. Still, rumors swirled about what it might have been used for, and even who might have boarded it when the war turned against Germany. because some believed this giant wasn't just built for supplies. It might have been a getaway plane for the most powerful men in the Third Reich. As the war dragged into its final months, the Bv-238 became more than just an aircraft. It became a symbol of possibility and a source of fear. By early 1945, Allied leaders were no longer just worried about German tanks or submarines. They were worried about what the Nazis might do to save themselves. Rumors spread that some of the highest-ranking officials in Hitler's circle were preparing escape routes out of Germany. And in those whispers, the Bv-238 kept coming up. One name appeared again and again: Martin Bormann, Hitler's powerful private secretary and one of the most wanted men in the Reich. According to some reports, there were discussions that the massive flying boat could be used as his ticket out of Europe. The logic was chillingly simple. With a range of thousands of miles, the Bv-238 could potentially fly from Germany to South America, a place where many Nazi fugitives would later surface. The idea wasn't completely far-fetched. The Allies already knew the aircraft could cross the Atlantic. They also knew it was big enough to carry dozens of men, supplies, or even treasure. In theory, it was the perfect escape machine. But that's all it remained: theory. By 1945, Germany was collapsing. The Allies had air superiority, and an aircraft as enormous as the Bv-238 could never have slipped quietly out of Europe. It would have been a flying target the moment it left the ground. Still, these rumors added a dangerous aura to the aircraft. It wasn't just a transport anymore. It was seen as a potential lifeline for men who were desperate to avoid justice. And for that reason, the Allies made sure it wouldn't survive until war's end. Because soon, the Bv-238 would be destroyed. But the mystery of who struck the killing blow remains unsolved to this day. By 1945, Germany was burning. Allied bombers pounded its cities, factories, and airfields into rubble. For the Bv-238, survival was impossible. The Allies knew this giant couldn't be allowed to fly again. But who delivered the final blow? That's where the story becomes murky. The official German version claims the prototype was hidden at Lake Chaussee, just east of Hamburg. There, moored quietly in the water, it waited out the final days of the Reich. But hiding something as massive as the Bv-238 was like trying to conceal a battleship in a swimming pool. It was only a matter of time before it was found. According to German sources, that moment came in May 1945. Witnesses reported that British Hawker Typhoons, or possibly Tempests, spotted the aircraft on the lake. They strafed it with cannon fire, igniting its 6 engines. Flames tore through the giant as it sank beneath the water, leaving only one wing visible above the surface. In this version, the Bv-238 died just days before Germany's surrender. But the Americans tell a very different story. According to U.S. accounts, the aircraft was destroyed months earlier, in September 1944. They credit Lieutenant Urban Ben Drew and his flight of P-51 Mustangs with taking it down. At the time, Drew believed he had shot up a Bv-222 Viking. Only decades later, research suggested that the target had actually been the legendary Bv-238 itself. 2 nations, 2 different timelines, 2 competing claims of victory. So, who's telling the truth? The reality is, we may never know. The fog of war left records fragmented, and eyewitness accounts conflict with one another. What's certain is that by the late 1940s, whatever remained of the Bv-238 was deliberately destroyed. Divers blew up the wreckage between 1947 and 1948 to clear the lake, ensuring the last traces of the giant were gone. The mystery over its destruction lingers to this day. Was it the RAF, the U.S. Army Air Forces, or did both sides, in the chaos of war, strike it at different times? No matter the answer, the result was the same. The only Bv-238 ever built was lost forever. But while the aircraft disappeared beneath the surface, the story of Blohm Voss didn't end there, and its legacy carries a darker chapter that few people know about. The BV-238 may have been destroyed, but the company that built it didn't vanish with the end of the war. In fact, Blohm Voss is still around today, producing ships and heavy machinery. On the surface, it looks like a story of survival, a German manufacturer adapting and thriving long after the fall of the Third Reich. But beneath that story lies a far darker chapter. During the war, Blohm Voss relied on forced labor. Prisoners of war and even concentration camp inmates were made to work at the company's Hamburg facilities under brutal conditions. Evidence suggests that the company may have even operated its own sub-camp, directly tied to the Nazi system of exploitation. This is the part of history that doesn't appear in glossy engineering photos or technical drawings.